Bigfoot reached out its hand to a hunter. During a standoff, what happened next is bone-chilling. A veteran hunter walked into the Idaho backcountry expecting nothing more than an elk hunt. But what he found in the snow were tracks so huge and so fresh, they seemed impossible to explain. Soon, the forest fell silent, and then came the knocks. Every time he moved, the echoes followed. Days later, standing alone in a frozen thicket, the hunter came face to face with something towering, something watching, and instead of charging, it did the unthinkable. It reached out its hand. Was this a sign of peace, a warning, or the start of something far darker? Stay with me, because what happened next will make you question everything you thought you knew about the woods. Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. I've been hunting the salmon chalice backcountry for over 30 years, starting back when my father first taught me to track elk through these remote Idaho mountains. The fall of 1997 would mark my last season there, though I didn't know it at the time. Looking back now, I should have recognized the signs, should have listened to that deep-seated instinct that all experienced outdoorsmen develop over decades in the wilderness. But I was too focused on proving I still had what it took to make one final successful hunt. My name's Daniel Reeves, and I've spent most of my life learning every drainage, ridge, and game trail in this unforgiving terrain. The Salmon Chalice. National Forest isn't kind to the unprepared or the arrogant. At 9,000 feet, the weather can turn deadly in minutes, and the steep, rocky terrain has claimed more than its share of overconfident hunters. But for those who respect the land and know how to read it, these mountains offer some of the best elk hunting in the lower 48 states. I'd taken my first bull elk here at 16, learned to navigate by compass and topographic map before GPS became common, and spent countless nights under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The area around Morgan Creek had become my second home, especially the remote western drainage that few other hunters bothered to access. It required a grueling 6-mile hike from the nearest Forest Service road, but that's exactly what made it special. The elk knew they were safer there, away from the crowds and four-wheelers. By 1997, arthritis had started creeping into my knees, and my doctor had warned me about pushing too hard at altitude. But I couldn't imagine not making my annual October trek into those mountains. I'd already secured my tag, and the early reports suggested it would be an exceptional season. September's rains had kept the vegetation lush, and several reliable sources confirmed large herds moving through the high country. The Morgan Creek drainage had always been good to me. I knew where the elk bedded down during midday heat, which springs they preferred even in late season, and how they'd move between feeding grounds depending on the wind. This intimate knowledge wasn't just about hunting success. It was about survival. When you're miles from any road and the weather turns, knowing the terrain can mean the difference between life and death. I'd planned this hunt meticulously, as always. My topographic maps were marked with likely elk movements based on the weather patterns, and I'd packed enough supplies to stay out for 10 days if necessary. The forecast showed clear skies for the first week of October, with temperatures dropping into the 20s at night. Perfect conditions for elk hunting at elevation. What I couldn't have planned for, what no amount of experience could have prepared me for, was what waited for me in that familiar wilderness. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I should explain exactly how everything unfolded, starting with that crisp October morning when I shouldered my pack and headed up the trail one last time. I set up my base camp in a familiar clearing, about 3 miles up from the old Forest Service road. The spot had served me well over the years, a natural hollow sheltered by towering ponderosa pines, with the North Fork of the Salmon River running cold and clear just 50 yards to the west. The late October air bit at my exposed skin as I worked, hinting at the winter that was already creeping down from the higher elevations. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s by late afternoon, and a thin layer of early snow dusted the ground in patches where the sun couldn't reach. I'd learned long ago to respect these mountains' capricious nature, especially during the shoulder seasons when summer and winter fought for dominance. One day of warm sunshine could give way to a week of brutal storms without warning. As I went, through the familiar motions of setting up camp, driving stakes for my 4-season tent, gathering dry firewood, and hanging my food cache, I found comfort in the solitude. After 3 decades in these woods, being alone felt more natural than being around people. The silence wrapped around me like an old friend, broken only by the steady rush of the river and the occasional snap of branches under the weight of wet snow. But something felt different. I noticed it first when I paused to catch my breath after hauling the last load of firewood. The usual evening chorus of birds was strangely muted. Normally, this time of day would bring a cacophony of chickadees and nuthatches settling in for the night, mountain jays squabbling over territory. Instead, there were only sporadic, half-hearted calls, as if the birds were trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves. I straightened up, letting my senses expand the way my father had taught me. The wind shifted slightly, bringing with it a scent I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual forest smells I'd grown accustomed to, not the sharp tang of pine sap, or the musty decay of fallen leaves, or even the distinctive musk of elk. This was something earthier, almost like wet fur mixed with soil, but not quite. It lingered at the edge of recognition, there and gone before I could pin it down. The rational part of my mind, the part tempered by thousands of hours in these mountains, tried to categorize it. Could be a bear den nearby, I thought. Or maybe just the peculiar way moisture trapped smells in the early winter air. But another part of me, the part that had learned to trust instinct over logic in the wilderness, noted it as something worth remembering. I finished securing my camp as the last light faded from the sky. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the beam of my headlamp. The fire caught quickly thanks to the dry kindling I'd collected, and soon I had a small but steady blaze pushing back the darkness. As I sat beside it, warming my hands and watching sparks drift up into the darkness, that strange quiet settled over the forest again. No owls called, no small animals rustled in the underbrush, just the steady murmur of the river and the soft pop of burning wood. I started my hunt before dawn on the second morning, leaving camp while stars still peppered the dark sky. 23 years of hunting these mountains had taught me the value of an early start. The elk would be moving from their night feeding grounds back to bedding areas, and I wanted to intercept them along their usual routes. The first ridge took me 45 minutes to climb, my boots crunching through patches of early snow. At 58 years old, I wasn't as fast as I used to be, but I made up for it with patience and knowledge of the land. I'd learned every drainage, every game trail, and every seasonal pattern in this part of the Salmon Chalice. The mountains had become like an old friend, predictable, reliable, and honest in their challenges. As the sun began painting the eastern sky, I paused to catch my breath and glass the opposite slope. The crisp morning air carried the scent of pine and wet earth, exactly as it should. I'd always found comfort in how nature followed its rhythms, the way chickadees announced the morning, how thermals developed as the day warmed, the predictable paths elk took between feeding and bedding grounds. Fresh tracks in the snow caught my attention, definitely elk and big ones. The prints were deep and clear, probably no more than 3 hours old. I began following them, reading the story they told. A small herd, maybe 6 or 7 animals, had moved through here, including at least one mature bull, judging by the stride length and hoof size. But something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but as I worked my way down, into the valley, the sensation grew stronger. The forest seemed too quiet. Normally, pine squirrels would be chattering their complaints at my presence, and small birds would be flitting through the understory. Today, though, the woods felt muted, as if holding its breath. I'd spent enough time in these mountains to know their moods. I'd weathered sudden snowstorms, dodged lightning on exposed ridges, and waited out territorial black bears. This feeling was different. The predictable patterns I'd come to trust, over 2 decades, felt subtly wrong, like a familiar room where someone had moved all the furniture an inch to the left. The elk tracks led me across a small creek and up another ridge. I moved slowly, checking wind direction and scanning ahead for movement. My old Winchester felt reassuring in my hands, its woodstock smooth from years of use. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen and observe, just as I'd always done. But where this practice usually brought clarity and connection to my surroundings, today it only heightened my unease. By mid-morning, I'd covered about 4 miles, working my way through 3 different drainages. The elk sign was still fresh, but the animals themselves remained elusive. In all my years hunting these mountains, I'd developed an almost intuitive sense of where game would be and how they'd move. Today, though, the elk weren't following their usual patterns. They seemed to be moving erratically, taking paths that made little sense for animals that typically conserved energy this close to winter. The morning's tracking had led me along a promising elk trail when I noticed something that made me stop, dead in my tracks. There, pressed into a patch of fresh snow between 2 lodgepole pines, was a footprint that didn't belong. My first thought was bear, but I'd seen enough bear signs over my 30 years in these mountains to know better. This was different. I knelt down to examine it more closely, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The impression was clearly defined in the crystalline snow, a foot-shaped track that measured easily 15 inches from heel to toe. The depth suggested whatever made it was heavy, far heavier than a man my size. What struck me most was the anatomical similarity to a human foot, complete with 5 distinct toe impressions, but scaled up to an impossible size. My hand hovered over the print, not touching it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Maybe it was a double print, where an animal had stepped twice in nearly the same spot. Or perhaps the snow had melted and refrozen, distorting a normal track. But the edges were too crisp, the impression too fresh. This had been made within the last few hours. Following the direction of travel, I found 3 more prints spaced about 4 feet apart. Each one was identical to the first, showing the same anatomical details with unnerving clarity. The stride length alone suggested something far larger than any known wildlife in these mountains. I'd tracked everything from mountain lions to moose, but this was entirely outside my experience. I pulled my small field notebook from my chest pocket, along with a pencil I kept for marking waypoints. My hands weren't quite steady as I sketched the outline of one of the clearer prints, carefully noting the measurements and adding details about the toe impressions. Next to the drawing, I recorded the date, time, and location, including my best estimate of the elevation. Whatever this was, I wanted a record. The logical part of my mind kept trying to dismiss what I was seeing. Snow can play tricks on you, create illusions and patterns that seem meaningful, but aren't. Yet in all my years of hunting and tracking, I'd never seen anything that matched these prints. They were too well defined, too consistent in their spacing and depth to be some random occurrence of nature. I found myself looking more carefully at the surrounding forest, suddenly aware of how the usual background sounds had changed. The chickadees that had been calling earlier were silent now. Even the wind moving through the pines seemed muted, as if the whole landscape was holding its breath. Standing up, I tucked my notebook away and adjusted my rifle strap, more for comfort than security. The elk sign I'd been following suddenly seemed less important. I knew I should continue my hunt. That's what I was here for, after all. But those tracks had shaken something loose in my understanding of these mountains, something I'd always taken for granted about what was and wasn't possible in these woods. The sun had already dipped behind the western ridge when I made it back to camp, my mind still wrestling with those tracks I'd found earlier. I got a fire, going quickly, more for comfort than warmth, though the temperature was dropping fast. The flames cast dancing shadows against the surrounding pines as I heated up some coffee and pulled out my freeze-dried dinner. I'd camped in these mountains countless times, but something felt different tonight. The usual evening chorus of birds had gone quiet too early, and even the wind seemed to pause unnaturally between gusts. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the darkening tree line, though I couldn't explain why. That's when I heard it, a sharp, distinct knock that echoed through the valley. My first thought was woodpeckers, since northern flickers were common in these parts. But woodpeckers don't work after sunset. I checked my watch. 7:45 in the evening. I shifted on my camp stool to get more comfortable, and within seconds, another knock responded from a different direction. This one was louder, more deliberate. I froze mid-motion, coffee cup halfway to my lips. The timing felt intentional. Over the next hour, I conducted an unplanned experiment. Each time I would move, reaching for more coffee, adding wood to the fire, adjusting my position, a knock would follow within seconds. Sometimes from the north, sometimes from the east. Once from so close it made me jump, though I couldn't spot anything in the darkness beyond my firelight. By 10 o'clock, my fire was burning low, but I couldn't bring myself to turn in. I'd counted 17 distinct knocks, each one perfectly, timed to my movements, no random pattern, no natural explanation I could think of. In 30 years of hunting these mountains, I'd never experienced anything like it. I pulled out my notebook, the same one where I'd sketched those tracks earlier, and started documenting the knocks, their direction, timing, and how they corresponded to my actions. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote, though I told myself it was just the cold. At 11:15, I made myself stand up to stretch, deliberately making more noise than necessary. 3 sharp knocks answered in rapid succession, forming a pattern that no woodpecker could replicate. They came from 3 different directions, almost like triangulation. The rational part of my mind tried to find explanations, maybe branches cracking in the cold, or some echo effect I didn't understand. But deep down, I knew I was being watched. Whatever had left those massive tracks in the snow was out there, hidden in the darkness, monitoring my every move. I stayed awake far longer than I'd planned, adding small sticks to keep the fire alive, my rifle close at hand. The knocks continued, though less frequently, as if whatever was out there was settling in for a long night of observation. Sleep felt impossible, even though I knew I'd need my energy for tomorrow's hunt. But after what I'd experienced, I wasn't sure if I was still the hunter here, or if I'd somehow become the hunted. I'd camped in these mountains for over 20 years, and the silence that settled around me that evening felt wrong. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and owls should have been starting up, but instead, an unnatural stillness pressed in from all sides. Even the wind seemed to die down, leaving only the soft pop and crackle of my campfire. Between spoonfuls of rehydrated beef stew, I kept catching myself straining to hear something, anything. The forest silence was like a held breath, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I had a job to do, fill my elk tag, and head home with a freezer full of meat for winter. The first knock came just after I'd finished cleaning my dishes. A sharp crack, like someone hitting a dead tree with a baseball bat, echoed from the ridge to my west. I barely registered it at first, assuming it was a piloted woodpecker working late, but woodpeckers don't usually feed after dark, and this sound had carried farther than any woodpecker I'd ever heard. I stood up, scanning the tree line, when another knock answered from the opposite direction, closer this time. The sound was deep, resonant, definitely not a bird. My hand instinctively went to the rifle propped against a nearby log, though I kept it there without picking it up. The rational part of my brain suggested other hunters might be signaling each other, but something about the timing felt deliberate, calculated. For the next hour, I tested a theory I didn't want to acknowledge. Every time I moved around camp, adding wood to the fire, walking to my tent, retrieving gear from my pack, a knock would follow within minutes. When I sat completely still, the forest remained dead quiet. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. By 10 o'clock, I'd counted 13 distinct knocks, each one seeming to come from a slightly different location, as if something was slowly circling my position. I found myself speaking out loud, trying to break the tension. Just checking. Me out, aren't you? My voice sounded thin and foreign in the darkness. I considered breaking camp and hiking out that night, but the thought of navigating these trails in the dark with whatever was out there seemed far riskier than staying put. Instead, I stoked the fire higher and pulled my sleeping bag out to the fireside rather than retreat to my tent. My rifle stayed within arm's reach. The knocks continued sporadically until well after midnight, always following my movements, always, just far enough away to prevent me from pinpointing their source. When I finally did drift off to sleep, it wasn't peaceful rest, but the exhausted surrender of someone who knows they're being watched. I woke at first light, groggy but determined. Those tracks I'd found yesterday needed a second look, and I wasn't. About to let some strange noises, no matter how unsettling, drive me out of these mountains before filling my tag. Still, as I shouldered my pack and headed out, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't just quiet anymore. It was listening. The next morning, I shouldered my pack and headed toward a promising ridge where I'd seen elk sign the previous day. The morning air was crisp, hovering just above freezing, and my breath formed thick clouds as I picked my way through the understory. Around 9 o'clock, I found a good vantage point overlooking a steep drainage and settled in with my binoculars. The slope across from me caught the morning sun perfectly, making it easier to spot movement. I methodically scanned the terrain, working my way from bottom to top in careful strips. That's when something caught my eye, but it wasn't an elk. About 600 yards across the valley, 3 tall pines were arranged in an unusual way. I adjusted my focus, thinking maybe it was just perspective playing tricks on me. It wasn't. The trees were definitely leaning together, forming what looked like a crude tripod structure. They were mature pines, each one at least 40 feet tall, and they met at a point maybe 30 feet up. That alone was strange enough. Trees don't naturally grow that way. But what really got my attention was something pale wedged in the junction where they met. I spent a good 20 minutes studying that formation through my binoculars. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it away, as storm damage, or maybe even bears marking territory, but neither explanation felt right. Those trees looked deliberately positioned, and whatever was stuck up there appeared purposefully placed. My curiosity finally got the better of me. I marked the location against some landmarks and began working my way down into the drainage. The descent took nearly an hour, picking my way through loose scree and deadfall. Coming up the other side was even slower, but I kept those 3 leaning pines in sight the whole time. When I finally reached the formation, my unease only grew. Up close, I could see that the trees hadn't been broken or blown over. They'd been bent somehow while still alive. Their trunks showed no splintering or damage, just smooth curves that brought them together at that high point. Green needles still covered their branches. This wasn't recent storm damage, but it was the object wedged in their junction that really made my skin crawl. From my new angle, I could clearly see it was an elk scapula, the shoulder blade. It was old, but intact, bleached nearly white by sun and weather. The bone had been wedged firmly into place, positioned so it would be visible from the valley below. This wasn't random chance or an animal cache. Someone, or something, had deliberately created this marker. I've been around enough kill sites to know how predators handle carcasses. Bears will sometimes cache meat up trees, but they tear and scatter bones. Mountain lions might drag parts up to a high perch, but they don't construct elaborate displays. This was different. This felt like a message, a deliberate sign placed where it would be seen. I took several photos with my disposable camera, making sure to include my hunting knife in frame for scale. The whole time, that oppressive silence from the night before seemed to press in around me. No birds called, no squirrels chattered, just the soft whisper of wind through pine needles and the sound of my own careful breathing. I finally reached the base of the strange structure around 11:30 in the morning. Standing beneath it, the formation was even more unsettling than it had appeared through my binoculars. The 3 pines, each about 18 inches in diameter, were indeed deliberately angled together. What really struck me was how they'd been stripped of their lower branches, leaving clean trunks up to about 12 feet. A gust of wind swept down the slope, and with it came a smell that made my stomach turn. It was a heavy, musky odor with undertones of decay, not quite like a carcass, but somehow worse. It reminded me of wet fur mixed with something else I couldn't place. The scent was strong enough to make me take a step back, and that's when I noticed what was wedged in the crown of the formation. It was an elk scapula, bleached white by sun and weather. The shoulder blade was jammed firmly into the junction where the three trees met, positioned in a way that seemed almost ceremonial. The bone was clean, no tissue remained, but it hadn't been there long enough to show the deep weathering you'd see after years of exposure. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't the work of bears or any other animal I knew. The precision of the placement, the deliberate arrangement of the trees, it spoke of intelligence and purpose. I've been in these mountains for decades, but I'd never seen anything like this. A branch snapped somewhere upslope, and I spun around, my hand instinctively finding the grip of my rifle. The forest had gone quiet again, that same unnatural silence I'd been experiencing over the past few days. I scanned the tree line carefully, and that's when I caught movement. Just a shadow, really. Something dark shifting between two lodgepole pines about 80 yards up the hill. My heart was pounding now, but I forced myself to stay still and watch. Another flicker of movement. This time to my left, closer. Whatever it was big enough to disturb the branches as it moved. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. That distinct sensation of eyes on you that every hunter knows. I began backing away from the structure, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. Every few steps, I'd catch another glimpse of something moving in my peripheral vision, always just out of clear sight. The shadow seemed to pace parallel to my retreat, keeping its distance but definitely tracking my movement. The musky odor grew stronger, carried on another gust of wind. It was all I could do not to break into a run. Instead, I maintained my measured pace, working my way back down toward the drainage. The movement in the trees continued, always just at the edge of visibility. A dark shape here, a shifting shadow there, but never anything I could definitively make out. Over the next 3 days, I tried to focus on my original purpose, filling my elk tag, but something had fundamentally shifted in these familiar woods. The silence that followed me was different from the usual quiet of hunting. This was a watching kind of silence, heavy with intention. I started each morning before dawn, moving carefully along the ridgelines where I'd typically spot elk at first light, but the game patterns had changed. Where I should have found fresh droppings or bedding areas, I instead discovered more of those massive prints pressed into the frost-covered ground. They always seemed to cross my path from the day before, as if something was deliberately intersecting my route. The knocking sounds continued, becoming more frequent. They would start as single sharp cracks, like someone hitting a hollow tree with a baseball bat. But now they often came in patterns of 3 or 4, echoing across the valley. What disturbed me most was their timing. They would begin shortly, after I made any significant movement, setting up my spotting scope, breaking branches for firewood, or simply changing position while glassing a slope. By my 4th day out, I began documenting everything in my notebook. It wasn't just for my own reference anymore. I found myself writing as if leaving a record for others to find. October 15th, 7:15 a.m. 3 distinct knocks from Northwest Ridge after starting morning fire. Temperature 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Fresh tracks found 50 yards from camp, heading east. 16-inch length, 7-inch width at ball of foot. I started marking trees with surveyor's tape, noting the locations of prints and other signs. Near one particularly clear track, I left a detailed sketch tucked into a plastic bag and secured it to a branch. The methodical documentation helped keep my thoughts ordered, fighting back against the growing sense of unreality. The forest itself seemed to be changing around me. Areas that should have been alive with squirrels and jays fell silent as I approached. Even the wind through the pines sounded muffled, as if the woods were holding its breath. I found myself stopping more frequently, turning slowly to scan the trees behind me. More than once, I caught movement at the edge of my vision, a shadow shifting between trunks, a branch swaying against the wind. But whenever I focused directly on these disturbances, they dissolved into the forest's deeper shadows. My entries grew more detailed. October 16th, 2:30 p.m. Odor present again, same musky scent from structure site. Duration approximately 3 minutes. Wind from northeast, 5 to 7 miles per hour. Multiple knocks followed my attempt to circle upwind. Source seemed to move with me. Found broken branches 8 feet up on adjacent pines. Fresh sap still weeping. Each night, the knocks would draw closer to my camp. I began building my fire larger than necessary for warmth, letting it burn through more wood than I could really spare. The light seemed to keep the sounds at a distance, but I could feel the pressure of observation growing stronger. Something was tightening a circle around me, testing my reactions, learning my patterns. I was no longer the hunter here. I had become the one being hunted. The overcast evening crept in earlier than usual, the heavy clouds dimming what remained of daylight. I had been following what looked like fresh elk sign along a gentle slope, my boots silent on the damp forest floor. The wind had died completely, leaving the air thick and still. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my hands tighten instinctively around my rifle, a low, guttural vocalization somewhere between a grunt and a breath, but deeper than any animal I'd encountered in 30 years of hunting these mountains. It came from beyond a dense thicket about 40 yards ahead, where the pines grew close together. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I froze mid-step, one foot hovering above the ground, my muscles locked in place. Years of hunting had taught me this response. Absolute stillness when something feels wrong. But this was different from the usual caution. This was primitive, a deep recognition of danger that bypassed conscious thought. The sound came again, closer now. Whatever made it was moving through the thicket with deliberate steps. I could hear branches bending, small twigs snapping under significant weight. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained steady on the rifle. I clicked the safety off as quietly as possible, though in that unnatural silence, it seemed to echo through the trees. The movement stopped. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then the branches at the edge of the thicket began to part, pushed aside by something massive. A dark shape emerged partially into view, and my mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. It stood upright, its height difficult to gauge. In the dim light but clearly towering over my 6-foot frame, the shoulders were impossibly broad, covered in what appeared to be dark, matted fur. The head remained obscured by branches, but I could make out the massive chest expanding with each breath. The musky odor I'd noticed days earlier now filled the air, sharp and wild. Neither of us moved. My finger rested alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself, a habit ingrained through decades of responsible hunting. But this was no elk. This was something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about these mountains. The figure shifted slightly, causing more branches to bend away. I caught a glimpse of what might have been an arm, proportioned like a human's but far larger, ending in what appeared to be a hand with distinct fingers. The movement revealed more of its bulk, and I estimated it must have weighed at least 700 pounds, possibly more. We remained locked in this standoff, neither advancing nor retreating. The rational part of my mind catalogued details, the way it balanced its weight, the deliberate nature of its movements, the fact that it seemed to be studying me as intently as I was studying it. The less rational part of my mind was screaming at me to run, to shoot, to do something. But I remained frozen, caught in a moment that felt suspended between the world I knew and something else entirely. The sound came again, closer now. Whatever was out there moved with deliberate steps, each footfall sending subtle vibrations through the ground that I could feel even through my insulated boots. The thicket rustled, branches parting with careful precision, rather than the rushed movement of fleeing game. My rifle, a trusted companion through countless hunts, felt suddenly inadequate in my trembling hands. I kept it lowered, some deep, instinct told me that raising it might be the worst thing I could do. The fading grey light filtered through the clouds, casting everything in a flat, shadowless dimness that made depth perception difficult. Then it stepped partially into view. I've tried many times since to describe what I saw in those first moments, but words always fall short. The figure was massive, its height difficult to gauge against the trees, but well over 7 feet. Its broad shoulders and thick torso were covered in dark hair that moved slightly in what little breeze remained. But it was the way it moved that struck me most, fluid and controlled. Nothing like the lumbering gait I'd imagined from those tracks I'd found days earlier. What happened next challenges everything I thought I knew about these creatures, about what's possible in our world. The figure, still partially obscured by the branches, slowly extended one arm toward me. Its hand, so human-like yet larger, with long fingers, open palm forward in what I can only describe as a deliberate gesture. It wasn't threatening, not exactly, but it wasn't entirely peaceful either. The palm faced me directly, fingers slightly spread, held steady in the air between us. I stood there, my heart hammering so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears, caught in a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Was this a warning to go no further? A sign of peaceful intention? Or something else entirely? An invitation, perhaps, though to what I couldn't begin to imagine. The creature's face remained in shadow, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me with an intelligence that made my skin prickle. My mind raced through options, each seeming worse than the last. If I ran, I'd be turning my back on something faster and stronger than me. If I raised my rifle, I might provoke an attack. If I stepped forward, but I couldn't make myself consider that option. So I stood, frozen in place, while this impossible moment stretched out in the gathering dusk. The air between us felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Neither of us moved. The forest around us had gone completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of distant water that had been my constant companion these past days. Just the soft sound of breathing. Mine, rapid and shallow, and something deeper, steadier, from the figure before me. Its hand, so human-like yet larger, extended toward me, palm forward, in what I could only interpret as a gesture of peace. Warning! The fingers were long, proportional, with visible knuckles and what appeared to be dirt or wear on the palm. This wasn't the clawed appendage of a predator, but something far more unsettling in its familiarity. Time seemed to stretch like cold honey. My breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the chill air. The creature remained motionless, arm extended, as if waiting for some response. The musky odour I'd encountered near the tripod structure days ago grew stronger. Not quite rotting, not quite animal, but distinctly organic, and unlike anything I'd experienced in decades of hunting. I couldn't move. My muscles had locked up, not from fear exactly, but from a profound uncertainty about what action would be right or wrong in this impossible moment. The rifle hung useless at my side, my trigger finger straight and away from the guard, as though I were approaching a fellow hunter's camp. The figure held its position for what must have been 30 seconds, but felt like hours. Then, with the same deliberate grace it had shown in its approach, it slowly lowered its arm. The movement released me from my paralysis, but I remained rooted in place, watching. Without any sudden motion, the creature took one step backward. The branches shifted around its massive frame, and I caught a clearer glimpse of its face. Dark, eyes set deep under a heavy brow, but the details refused to resolve in my memory later. Perhaps my mind simply couldn't process what I was seeing. Another step back, and the figure began to withdraw into the thicket. The branches swayed back into place, and that overwhelming presence began to fade. In its wake, it left behind that distinctive odour and a set of impressions in the wet snow, clear prints that would be gone with the next snowfall. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sling my rifle. Every instinct as a hunter urged me to follow, to document, to understand, but a deeper wisdom kept me in place. This wasn't my quarry. This wasn't my moment to push. I began backing away, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot where the creature had stood. No pursuit came, no sound of movement through the brush. Just the returning whisper of wind through the pines and gradually, the tentative calls of birds resuming their evening songs. The light was failing fast now, and I maintained my slow retreat until I could no longer see the thicket clearly. Only then did I turn, every nerve in my body electric with awareness, and begin making my way back toward my camp. I stopped frequently to listen, to check my surroundings, but the forest had returned to its normal rhythms. Whatever intelligence had chosen to reveal itself to me had also chosen to let me go. The deep prints remained behind me in the snow, silent testimony to an encounter that would reshape everything I thought I knew about these mountains and what they might harbour in their remote valleys. 3 days later, I sat in my truck in the sheriff's office parking lot, my notebook and sketches spread across the passenger seat. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered asphalt, and I watched county employees arrive for their shifts, wondering if I was making a mistake. My hands trembled slightly as I gathered my documentation, not from cold, but from the weight of what I was about to share. The front desk directed me to Deputy Marshal, a clean-cut man in his mid-40s who greeted me with practiced politeness. His office was small but orderly, with a window overlooking the courthouse square. I noticed how his expression shifted from professional interest to subtle skepticism as I explained my reason for visiting. I'd been hunting these mountains for over 20 years, I began, spreading my notebook on his desk. What I encountered up there, I need to report it officially, even if it sounds impossible. The deputy leaned back in his chair, pen poised over his incident report form. Take your time, sir. I walked him through everything chronologically. The tracks I'd found, their measurements carefully recorded in my sketches, the strategic knocking sounds that followed my movements, the structure with the elk scapula, and finally, the encounter itself. As I described the figure's height and the deliberate gesture it had made, I watched Deputy Marshal's face settle into a mask of polite disbelief. The prints were clear in the snow, I insisted, pushing forward the detailed drawings I'd made, each one over 15 inches long with 5 distinct toes, the stride length alone. Mr. Harrison, he interrupted gently, setting down his pen. You were alone up there for how many days? 7 days, I replied, knowing where this was heading. 7 days, in challenging terrain, probably sleep-deprived from hunting dawn to dusk. He smiled sympathetically. The mind can play tricks, especially in isolation. We get reports every season from experienced outdoorsmen who've convinced themselves they've seen something unusual. But the tracks, I started, could be overlapping bear prints, melted and refrozen, the knocking sounds, woodpeckers or branches in the wind. As for what you saw in the low light, he shrugged. Maybe a bear standing or shadows playing tricks. The human mind likes to find patterns, make connections. I watched him slide my notebook back across the desk, his report form barely filled out. The dismissal was clear, wrapped in professional courtesy. He'd already categorized my experience, filed it away with all the other stress-induced misidentifications that probably filled some drawer in their records room. I understand you felt compelled to report this, Deputy Marshal said, standing to signal our meeting's end. But I'd suggest getting some rest before your next hunting trip. Maybe take a partner next time. I gathered my notes, feeling oddly hollow. The evidence that had seemed so compelling in the field, the precise measurements, the strategic placement of signs, that deliberate gesture, all of it crumbled under the fluorescent lights of bureaucracy. As I walked back to my truck, I realized that some experiences weren't meant for official records. I was gathering my sketches from the deputy's desk, trying not to let my frustration show, when I noticed a man in a faded search and rescue jacket lingering near the office doorway. He'd been quietly organizing some trail maps while I gave my report, but now his attention was fixed on the drawings I was collecting. Mind if I take a look at those? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There was something in his tone. Not the dismissive skepticism I'd gotten from the deputy, but a careful, measured interest that made me pause. I handed him the notebook. His weathered hands turned the pages slowly, studying each sketch with the kind of attention that told me he wasn't just being polite. When he reached the drawing of the tripod structure with the elk scapula, he drew in a sharp breath. "This was up near Miller Creek drainage?" he asked, glancing toward the deputy's now empty office before meeting my eyes. I nodded. "About 3 miles past the old fire lookout." He returned the notebook, then gestured for me to follow him to a quiet corner of the station. "I've been working search and rescue in this county for 17 years, he said, keeping his voice low. "There's things about that drainage. Well, let's just say you're not the first to come in with a story like this." My pulse quickened. The deputy seemed pretty sure I was seeing things. The volunteer's eyes crinkled with what might have been sympathy. "Yeah, that's usually how it goes. Official channels don't much care for reports they can't explain. But some of us who've spent enough time up there, we keep our own mental notes." He pulled out a topographical map, spreading it across a small table. His finger traced the familiar contours of the area where I'd been hunting. 2 years ago, had a lost hiker case. Found him after 3 days, totally rattled. Kept talking, about structures in the trees, sounds that followed him. Last spring, a wildlife biologist doing bear surveys. She quit mid-season. Wouldn't say why, exactly, but she mentioned tracks that shouldn't exist. "And nobody investigates?" I asked. He folded the map carefully, his movements deliberate. "Officially, no, but there's a handful of us. Rangers, guides, old-timers. We compare notes sometimes, keep track of where things happen, when. Not for any report, just to know." I recognized the caution in his voice, the way he chose his words. It was the same instinct that had made me hesitate before coming to the sheriff's office. The fear of sounding crazy, of losing credibility. But here was someone who understood that some truths exist in the spaces between official records. "The hand gesture you mentioned," he said quietly. "Palm forward, like a signal to stop." When I nodded, he didn't elaborate, but his expression told me enough. He'd heard this detail before. As I turned to leave, he touched my arm lightly. "Listen, if you ever need to, discuss anything else you might remember about your time up there. Most of us old SAR folks grab coffee at Carol's Diner on Thursday mornings." He slipped me a worn business card with his name and number. "Sometimes it helps to talk with people who won't write it off as just another tall tale." Walking to my truck, I felt the weight of his card in my pocket. A small token of validation, a thread connecting me to others who'd seen behind the ordinary veil of these mountains. 23 years have passed since that encounter in the Salmon Chalice Wilderness, and still, I find myself awake some nights, replaying that moment when the figure emerged from the thicket. Time hasn't dulled the memory. If anything, it's given me too many hours to analyze every detail, every nuance of that strange interaction. Recording begins. I'm speaking this into record now because, well, I suppose because I need to make sense of it, even after all these years. That gesture, that open palm, it haunts me more than anything else. You'd think the size of the creature, or that otherworldly sound it made would be what stayed with me. But no, it's that deliberately human movement that keeps me up at night. In all my years as a hunter, I've never seen anything in nature that communicates that way. Bears don't gesture. Mountain lions don't try to signal. But this was different. That hand, and I'm certain it was a hand, not a paw, moved with purpose, with intelligence. Sometimes I convince myself it was offering peace, some kind of primitive recognition between two thinking beings. The way it held that pose, steady, non-aggressive. But then, the darker thoughts creep in. Was I seconds away from something horrible? Was it warning me away from its territory? Or was it sizing me up? The fact that it let me leave, was that mercy? Or was I just lucky? You have to understand. I've spent my entire adult life in those mountains. I know every ridge, every drainage, every seasonal pattern. I thought I understood the rules out there. But that encounter, it showed me how little we really know about what shares these wild places with us. That search and rescue volunteer I met at the sheriff's office, he knew. All those old-timers who gather at Carol's Diner, sharing their stories in hushed voices. They know too. There's a whole hidden history in those mountains, passed down in whispers and careful glances. Official reports might dismiss it, but the knowledge persists, carried by people who've seen too much to deny. The thing that really gets to me now, looking back, is how it all felt, orchestrated. The tracks appearing where I would find them. The knocks that seemed to herald my movements. That structure with the elk bone. It wasn't random. Whatever I encountered out there, it was studying me just as much as I was tracking it, maybe more. And that's what I need people to understand. If you're heading into those mountains, especially around Miller Creek drainage, you need to know you're being watched. Not by something simple, not by something we can easily categorize. Whatever intelligence is out there, it operates by its own rules, its own logic. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can predict its intentions based on our human understanding. That open hand. Was it saying hello or goodbye? Was it offering friendship or marking me? Even now, I'm not sure. And maybe that uncertainty is the most important thing I learned out there. The wilderness. It holds secrets we're not equipped to understand. Sometimes, the best we can do is acknowledge our ignorance and treat these encounters with the gravity they deserve. Because whatever that being was, whatever still roams those ridges, it may not mean what we think it does. Its gestures might speak a language we're not ready to translate. So this is my warning, for whatever it's worth. If you find yourself up there and the birds go quiet and you feel that weight of being watched, remember my story. Remember that open hand and understand that you're standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, something that's been there long before us and will remain long after we're gone. Recording ends. Thank you for being part of this moment. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to share another story that comforts the soul.